Hello, once again, Helldivers. Today, on April the 2nd, we got a new patch from Arrowhead. This patch addresses a lot of inconsistencies and makes a lot of overall good changes, so let's not waste any time and get straight into them. First of all, we have some new planetary hazard additions, blizzards and sandstorms. We aren't sure yet if these will be just to reduce visibility or if there will actually be some sort of damage done to Helldivers and enemies with it. Helldiver level cap has also been increased from the original 50 to 150. This also does include new titles to be able to be earned by the highest level divers. This level change also includes all XP that you have gotten even if you hit level 50 before the change. So for me, I went from being level 50 straight to 55. Now we're going to continue to the balancing section where the Retrieve Essential Personnel mission has been made easier by needing fewer civilians on higher difficulties as well as making the enemy spawn further away, as these missions were notorious for being one of the most unfair with enemy spawns. Next, the Destroy Command Bunkers for the bot missions will have more objective locations because this was one of the easiest bot missions before. This should fix the problem of it being a little too easy, and now this mission type can also appear on difficulty 5, letting those who haven't got to 7 through 9 yet to be able to play these missions and not try to learn them on the fly of a difficulty 9 mission. And finally, to the operations modifiers. The only one that has been changed in this modifier is that the increased cooldown and call-in time on stratagems. These have been cut in half to 25% for the cooldown increase and 50% for the call-in time. This is a huge improvement from the previous 50 and 100% increases because when these were stacked with AA defenses, it really limited your playstyles when dealing with the bot missions. Now for the big juicy part, weapon balancing and changes. First of all, the arc thrower is finally getting looked at and the inconsistency of its charge time is changing to now always be 1 second. There was an odd thing that I noticed anytime I used the arc thrower, that if you try firing it as fast as you could essentially decrease the charge up time for it to fire. This should not be the case anymore as of today's patch. This does make it fire a little bit slower, but overall, it's more of just a quality of life thing and just not as confusing that way. The arc thrower range was also nerfed down from 50 meters to 35 meters. This is a very noticeable difference, but it still doesn't really make or break the weapon for me. The range wasn't really the craziest thing about the weapon. It was more of the arc and the fact that it could essentially pierce any level of armor. So I do still think that this is one of the best weapons that you should be using overall. One of the other slight changes that it did get was also the new stagger effect. Should be increased for it now. This should definitely make it to where it's easier to tell that your hits are landing if you are able to stagger and sort of stun lock an enemy, because there were some enemies that I felt like sometimes I couldn't really tell if I was hitting or not. So hopefully this should help to sort of circumvent that problem. Next up, we have the Guard Dog. Specifically the one that fires bullets is getting changed so that it refills its entire ammo from resupply boxes. This doesn't really move the needle for me for which guard dog to use because it doesn't address the whole problem of the Liberator version of the guard dog. It still has to be refilled to continue firing where the LAS guard dog does not. As long as that is still the case, I still do not think that the Liberator Guard Dog is worth using for your missions personally. Just because of the fact that with the LAS Guard Dog, you do not have to do some sort of upkeep to be able to continue using it. And then after that, we have a pretty big buff to the anti-material rifle. It's getting a flat 30% increase to its damage that makes it more of a thought to actually bring the AMR specifically for bot missions because of the amount of damage it is going to be able to put out now. I was a little worried with the introduction of the Quasar Cannon that it wasn't going to take much thinking to decide what you were going to use, the anti-material rifle or the Quasar Cannon, but now I think it's a much more worthwhile pick because of that flat damage increase. I still think one of the best additions that can happen for the AMR is that it gets hit markers added for it. As of right now, it's a little difficult to tell if the AMR actually pierces all levels of armor or not because the bullet will just explode when it hits the target regardless. So you don't get any feedback for shooting things like chargers or hulks. You just get the explosive. So at the end of the day, it's a little hard to tell if your shots are actually doing any damage or not, so you're a little dissuaded from continuing to shoot like the heaviest armor targets. The Breaker Incendiary also got an overall buff to help it compete with the other top tier shotguns. Its damage per bullet is being increased from 15 to 20. This will make it feel not nearly as bad as it did with killing medium targets. Fire tick damage overall got an increase by 50%. This includes the flamethrower, breaker incendiary, as well as incendiary mines, but it also does apply to enemies that deal fire damage as well, such as the Hulk Scorcher. This makes it to where the burning tick damage can really serve its purpose of area denial capabilities. Hulk Scorchers now, however, have the potential to almost instant kill any Helldiver. I know some people thought that it was already an instant kill before, but you could dive out of the way as you were being hit for maybe 1 or 2 frames or so. There wasn't a lot of leeway to begin with. Now there's about none. And now, as a matter of fact, the burning tick damage actually outpaces the stim healing effect for your health. So flames in particular are now very, very deadly. One of my personal favorite weapons also got a great quality of life improvement. The Liberator Penetrator now has a full auto mode. I thought before that the recoil wasn't so severe that a full auto mode would potentially work and would make it feel significantly better to use. This makes it to where I personally want to bring the Liberator Penetrator over the normal Liberator, and after having used it for I think only 1 bug mission so far, while the damage is obviously lower and you do have to reload more frequently, it's now more of a preference rather than using something that's a burst weapon as opposed to a full auto weapon. That was one of the reasons I would bring the Liberator even on potentially Helldive missions over the Liberator Penetrator. The Dominator from the Sealed Veterans War Bond also got a buff where the damage has been increased from 200 to 300, and also makes the Dominator much more viable to use. Because of the projectile working differently than normal bullets, it is still a gun that takes some getting used to before bringing into high difficulty missions. The other buff it received was similar to the Arc Thrower. It now has increased stagger, hopefully allowing follow-up hits with the Dominator to be made that much easier. The Diligence Counter Sniper got a huge buff to it that I thought it desperately needed. It is now able to pierce medium armor. This makes a huge difference, as one of my main gripes with the Counter Sniper compared to the normal Diligence was that there wasn't too much separating it. It did only slightly more damage and had less bullets in the magazine, so I am personally very happy to see this change. Next up is the Slugger, which did get some nerfs, but it also has one thing fixed. Next up is the Slugger, which did get some nerfs to it, but also one thing that was fixed. The first thing is that the damage got knocked down from 280 to 250. It has reduced stagger, and the demolition force size has decreased. I'm not completely sure what the demolition force part means exactly, but the damage and stagger decrease is not really going to make me regret running the weapon still. The other main thing was the Slugger said it only pierced light armor, but if you used it, the Slugger seemed to actually pierce medium armor. This is now fixed, and the Slugger does actually say that it does pierce medium armor when you're looking at it in the weapons menu. Speaking of fixing armor piercing tags, however, the Senator, which is a revolver from the Sealed Veterans War Bond, did the same thing as the Slugger, where it seemed to pierce heavier armor than what it said it was supposed to, but now the tag correctly does say that it pierces medium armor as well. Lastly, for correct tags, the Liberator Concussive now says that it pierces light armor and no longer says explosive. One of the biggest issues I had with this weapon was that it said it was an explosive weapon, but when you used it, it has a sort of explosive effect on hit, but didn't actually do damage to other enemies typically. This is because it fires a concussive round that mostly causes a target to stagger and stay stun locked, and not necessarily focus on the explosive AoE. The tag that said explosive no longer appears on the Liberator Concussive as of now. The Recoilless rifle and the spear got similar buffs, where supply boxes now give back more rockets for them. The Recoilless rifle now gets 3 rockets back, and the spear now gets 2. This is a great buff to both of these weapons, as I did make a comment before that it felt like a chore to keep up with the ammo for both of these weapons, and hopefully this should not be the case now. Lastly, for weapons, the heavy machine gun highest fire rate has been decreased from 1200 RPM to 950 RPM for it to be more manageable. I honestly don't really like this change at all. If I wanted to use a more moderate RPM, I would use the default 800 that it is set to. This still does not address the main issue of this weapon to me, that it still doesn't have a reticle and still has far too little ammo. If I want to use the HMG at the highest rounds per minute, don't take that option away from me. And then next, for balancing, we have one stratagem being changed with the Patriot Exosuit having its rocket changed its armor piercing value to only when it makes a direct hit on an enemy. This should have been the case from the beginning, so this is a change that I am personally happy to see. Now on to balancing the enemies of democracy. Charger's normal melee stomp now does less damage to exosuits. This is great because the exosuit lacked the mobility to get away from a charger, so its normal melee stomp could take out an entire exosuit almost instantaneously. Next up, Bile and Nursing Spears have finally had their puke attacks addressed, and now they do less damage overall. This is a huge change, as these enemies were capable of one-shotting multiple Helldivers if they got too close, so I'm personally thrilled to see this change. Bile Titans also can no longer be stunned with EMS strikes, EMS mortars, or with stun grenades. Stun grenades in particular were very useful for stunning Bile Titans and wouldn't just get them to stop moving, but they wouldn't even attack, letting them be open to getting destroyed very quickly. While I wish this was still an option, I understand why they don't want it to be, and now Bile Titans work in the exact same way as the Annihilator tanks or the Shredder tanks for the bots, where stun nades and EMS strikes no longer affect them at all. Next up is the Shriekers. These things have been complete menaces since they came out. They will no longer be able to call in bug breaches and will also no longer do the insane amount of damage that they were doing when they would collide with something after they died. I personally even saw a clip of a Bile Titan being instant killed by a dead Shrieker landing on it. Hopefully this should not be the case, but this will have to be tested further. Next up is another big topic that keeps getting brought up: armor. Medium armor now protects 5% more damage, and heavy armor now does 10% more damage. This is to hopefully make it to where wearing heavy or medium armor really does give that fantasy of being much more tanky than using the light armor counterpart. This was starting to be the case with the armor value fix, but still wasn't as big of a difference as I personally would have liked. Now we'll have to do some more testing to see how much damage you can really take while using heavy armor, but from my testing of running just a few bug missions and bot missions with heavy armor, I was able to shrug off a lot of hits before I was basically forced to use a stim. And then we have some smaller general fixes, such as enemies not properly targeting Patriot Exosuits, being able to fire your Patriot Exosuit weapons while trying to use the map. But one of the biggest things that's been fixed is the improved system that prevents Hellpod steering close to large or important objects. This was a thing that everyone ran into a lot, especially whenever it's a smaller map or there's like a bigger overall objective, like one of the airbase command centers for the automatons. This system essentially was in place to prevent you from soft locking yourself if you destroyed like an objective area accidentally whenever you came back in from being respawned from a Hellpod. But it was, however, being a little bit too restrictive, especially I would see this whenever we were played like the Termicide deployment missions, where the big towers are considered the entire objective. So if you were anywhere in the vicinity of it, you just couldn't steer your Hellpod literally at all. And then one of the last changes we're going to go over is the Ballistic Shield changes. The collision mesh has been slightly increased in size for a little bit more forgiveness, and they also changed some of the shield poses so that less of the Helldiver is exposed when using the Ballistic Shield. This I hope does make it a much more viable pick for breaking into especially like bot missions. This stratagem I haven't really loved a lot of, especially with the lack of a lot of really good one-handed weapons. I liked it a little bit more with the LAS Scythe pistol, being able to effectively fight for a long period of time with a one-handed weapon does definitely feel a lot better, but I still think one-handed weapons need to come a bit more Like, they need to rise up a little bit more before I really want to use the Ballistic Shield anymore. But that's kind of it for most of the changes. Thank you guys so much for watching this update on the patch notes. Definitely make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to get this video to as many people as possible. But now let me know how you guys are feeling about the patch notes. Do you like all the changes? Do you dislike some of the changes? What more would you like to see be changed in the future? Let me know in the comments down below. But until then, thank you guys so much for watching the next video. Keep diving.